Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 15, our last week of lectures for MC 100. This week, we'll be discussing public relations. Now, when you think of public relations, you may think of people like this. This is how Hollywood portrays the field of public relations, but often the representation in the media of the field of public relations is highly inaccurate because it's not nearly about all of the partying and the events. It's not always a crisis like Olivia Pope. And so there are a lot of facets of public relations that are misunderstood by the public, primarily because true PR is not discussed very much within media. So, what is public relations? And how is it different from advertising? Well, public relations is the total communication strategy conducted by a person, a government, or an organization attempting to reach and persuade an audience to adopt a point of view. This is your textbook's definition. And when we're thinking about the difference between PR and advertising, public relations is really about earned media. It's about building trust with the public through credible sources. And advertisers, on the other hand, pay in order to get their advertisements to be exposed to the public. And it's inherently biased because it comes from the advertiser, the person trying to sell something. And so public relations really utilizes the media as well as public opinion as the main story, where ads are seen as secondary to media content. So, the ability for public relations to really get free exposure for clients through public relations and media relations is one of the key aspects that makes it so integral to business in America. Almost every single company is going to have some kind of PR or communications expert that really focuses on how the company can appear to the outward facing public. Now, your textbook mentions a couple of PR representatives who are very famous. And I thought that these quotes were good representations of what PR is, especially in contrast to advertising. Now, advertising is saying you're good, says Gassy. But PR is getting someone else to say you're good. So it's about moving away from your voice into public opinion for PR. Richard Branson, who is the founder at Virgin Group, of a very famous company, of course, and a big PR influencer, says publicity is absolutely critical. A good PR story is infinitely more effective than a front page ad. And this is very true. When it comes to purchasing decisions, people are typically more influenced by public relations campaigns than they are advertising dollars. And this is because when we're going back to the difference between PR and advertising, you see that you, as a media consumer, would be more skeptical to believe the claims of an advertisement, knowing that the end goal is to sell. While if you're getting influence of what the public thinks about the brand, or what a media story is saying about the brand or organization, you're more likely to believe that as credible because it comes from that third party source. So, PR, again, is a very critical aspect of communication as a field, as well as the business industry. Now, public relations has developed into an applied social science. The main goal, of course, is to influence behavior and policy in order to motivate individuals or groups to make specific course of action. So you're always wanting to tell the audience as a PR professional what the call to action is. What are you wanting them to do? And PR is really about creating, changing, or reinforcing opinions and attitudes about a brand, an organization, a person. And it's about how you influence people. And because of that goal, it draws on several of the social sciences to create one field. And so a lot of PR representatives, people who work in PR, will study psychology, sociology, political science, economics, cultural anthropology, and geography in order to better understand how to influence public opinion and attitudes. Now, I worked as a PR professional for over 5 years, and over the course of that 5 year period, and I was working in nonprofit PR, we've really seen a drastic change in the industry in terms of having to work in the digital sector as well as traditional media sectors to really influence opinion in proper ways. And this has led to a large growth in the field. And in fact, within the communication field, which compromises or is composed of a lot of different industries. Within communication, PR is the fastest growing of all communication fields. There are over 7,000 PR firms in the United States, which includes in house firms as well as independent firms. But all PR representatives will use what's called the ropes model in order to create their content and their campaigns. And so you have to be able to research. You're conducting research about your brand, your client, the audience, you're creating SMART objectives, which means that they're specific, they're measurable, they're achievable, and so on and so forth, so that you can really meet your goals and prove your worth to your company or your client in your PR tactics. You also are responsible for programming, meaning that you're producing the content, whether that's speeches, whether that's a PSA, a press release, things of that nature. So you're having to create content, which means you're doing a lot of media writing all the time. And then you have to be able to evaluate your campaign, which means you have to be able to show that you have made a return on the investment that your company or client has given you, and that you can meet those objectives, those goals that you outlined at the beginning of the campaign. And then the last part of the ropes model is really a recent addition within the past decade, where they have added stewardship as part of the PR model, because paying attention to the social and ethical implications of PR campaigns is increasingly important today. Now, who is the public in public relations? This is something I get asked often, and the answer is it varies. The public can be either the general public, like the US population or maybe even the world population, but there are also other specific audiences that certain types of PR will work with. One of the primary factors or sources of influence that you'll need to be working with as a PR professional are the media, the traditional media, as well as digital and convergent media, like bloggers or podcasters. So, all the different types of media that we have discussed thus far in the semester, a PR representative is really seeking to influence them as that third party that can be the driver of public opinion. In terms of your employees, if you're working either within a company, so for example, I was an internal communications PR representative for UAB Medicine. So one of my primary jobs was to communicate with the over 5,000 employees that UAB has and make them an influencer and a public opinion driver about the hospital. And so internal communications or internal PR are those that really look at the employees of a business or a client that you're working with. We also have government relations. This can be anything from a lobbyist who often deal with public relations to someone who is working on a PR campaign for a candidate or for a government organization. Now, of course, the community that you're working in is going to be a public that you work with, as well as consumers. So sometimes people think PR is only for organizations or nonprofits, and that's not true. Every company who is for profit really needs to have an eye on public relations if they don't have someone in that position specifically, because your consumers need to be aware of your brand and supportive of your brand, and so being a PR representative for a for profit client is important as well. Now, there are also important aspects of PR that deal business to business. For example, when I was working with the American Heart Association, one of my primary jobs was working with high end companies and donors who were stakeholders for the nonprofit organization in terms of fundraising. And so I was actually working with other companies that supported our organization and doing that business to business type PR. And then, of course, investors are also an important stakeholder that you need to communicate to as a PR representative. Now, in terms of the public relations tools that you will use if you were to go into PR, or the tools that are being used currently that you are often exposed to as a media consumer, news and press releases tend to be one of the primary job factors of a PR representative. Like I said, trying to get the media to cover your organization, product, or client is a critical aspect of PR. But sometimes this is only referred to by a media relations team. So not all PR representatives will do this, but it is a skill that all PR professionals need to have. A video news release is one where you actually create an entire news story, and the broadcast television station, or sometimes uh, only the audio will be picked up for a radio segment. But broadcasters and online news will then pick up your VNR as is. And so you're getting to control the voice of what is being said. Public service announcements are typically commercials or spots that run on broadcasts. Sometimes they can run in print if you have a print PSA. And these are to promote a nonprofit organization, a cause, or a government policy to make the public more aware. These are often not purchased unless there is a large PR campaign going on that has a little bit more budget. But when I was working for the American Heart Association, for instance, we would run PSAs on heart health and heart awareness very often, and I would get those placed for free with local media because that is a public service that the news operation is doing. Media relations is, of course, an important aspect of public relations because media are such large influencers of public opinion. Uh, some PR professionals also do special events or pseudo events. Pseudo events are those that are created specifically to gain press coverage, and we'll talk about one of those coming up. But some PR professionals do event planning, although that is not typically a primary job task of a PR professional. Now, community and consumer relations is, of course, critically important for public relations because, again, you're trying to influence public opinion. And so, if there is a large Twitter controversy, for instance, over one of your products or an advertisement that's running, it is then the PR representative's job to manage those conversations online and in the general public. Lobbying can be another aspect of public relations, although sometimes falls under the political science career field. But there's a lot of overlap in PR and political science when it comes to lobbying, because a lobbyist is someone who works to influence government leaders to adopt certain policies or to support certain candidates through the use of public relations tactics. And the lobby industry has grown significantly over the past few years. It is a $3.3 billion industry. Now, there is another sector of public relations that deals specifically with crisis management, and sometimes a PR representative will have to do all of these things. And when a crisis comes up, then their job kind of changes in the aspect that they're reacting to a crisis rather than trying to be proactive with their public relations management. But there are some people, similar to like an Olivia Pope, who are specifically hired during a crisis to manage that crisis for an organization. So crisis communication is are those PR professionals who are trying to manage public opinion when something bad happens. And then, of course, social media and digital management is a key aspect of public relations. So let's go through some of these tools. Here is a VNR from Chevy. And again, this would have run as a news story on broadcast TV stations and making it appear like it is a news story, but it actually runs as this video news release. And so many stations actually outlaw the use of VNRs, but sometimes they still make it to air. So here's an example.
One of the biggest signs the economy is recovering is the tremendous growth in car and truck sales. And what are Americans most interested in as they venture back into dealerships?
Subcompact utilities are popular and getting more popular because they give you the efficiency of a subcompact sedan or hatchback with higher seating position, generally all-wheel drive option, and some more interior space.
What started off as sort of a necessity-based utilitarian vehicle because of high gas prices has really caught on. People just love the size, they love the ease, and they just love what they can get for their money.
Hitting showrooms right now is the Chevrolet Trax, already popular in 66 countries across the world, where city driving demands versatility and maneuverability. The US version comes with an abundance of technology, including available 4G LTE, creating a Wi-Fi hotspot for up to 7 devices.
This is where many drivers want to be. A vehicle with the versatility to fit their lifestyle, the technology to keep them connected, and the fuel efficiency to keep them happy.
The Trax offers an EPA estimated 34 miles per gallon on the highway and was just awarded top safety pick from the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety. I'm Brian Osuch.
So you can see from that VNR, it appears to be a journalistic news story, which would be unbiased. But because it was produced by Chevy, you'll notice all of the video is of Chevy vehicles. Even though they're talking about the popularity of SUVs in the public and the trends in the industry, they're only talking about a trend that suits their company and their new product. In addition, they're using third-party sources, such as, the Society of Automobile Engineers, I think was the guy's title, or Edmund.com. And they're making it seem like this is not something coming from Chevy. So the ethical considerations of this are great. However, a lot of journalists still use VNRs in many different capacities. So it remains a popular way to pitch stories to the media. Here's an example of an old school PSA that utilizes some of my favorite characters.
R2? Where are you? R2? R2? R2, you're on fire! R2-D2, you found a cigarette. Well, I don't think smoking is grown up at all. Because it's very dangerous. Smoking does dreadful things to your lungs and is very bad for your heart. Well, I know I don't have one, but humans do, and I think we should set a good example. Well done, R2. Oh, hello. You know smoking is bad for your health, and it isn't grown up at all. So please, don't smoke. R2, do you really think I don't have a heart?
So PSAs are particularly useful because they can influence public opinion without costing a lot. Health PSAs are very common, as well as safety PSAs, like having to wear your seatbelt, wearing a mask in public during the pandemic, things of that nature. So PSAs are actually a very critical tool used by PR professionals. Now, pseudo events, as we spoke about before, are those that are meant to generate press coverage. So, for instance, 7-Eleven turned some of their stores into quickie marts in a collaboration with The Simpsons in order to gain publicity and attention for doing so. And so, this is an example of a PR campaign that used a pseudo event to gain media coverage. Now, the main tasks of public relations professionals are to write and send news releases and pitch stories to the media. So, journalists will cover them. The problem, of course, being that there is less control over the message once you give it to a third party, like a journalist or a blogger, to cover. The organization loses some of the ability to control the brand voice, like you would for an advertisement. And so, but this remains one of the most important tasks for public relations slash media relations. Having conversations across digital platforms, especially social media, is particularly important. You will find, I think, in the next few years that responding to consumers on social media is going to be a growing part of the PR industry because the audience and the consumers are expecting to have that level of interaction when an organization, a company is online. And so a lot of people are going to social media, for instance, to give complaints and things like that. And PR professionals are going to start being required more and more often to actually respond to those. In addition, you might write and design online or print publications like brochures, newsletters, flyers, have strategic communication campaigns, both internal and external, where you're planning an entire campaign. This can be as small as something like trying to promote re-entry testing for students as a PR professional for the University of Montevallo, or it can be as comprehensive as the CDC trying to recommend social distancing guidelines and how do you implement that nationwide. That would, of course, be a larger external campaign where those at Montevallo are running an internal campaign for students to comply with those regulations. It's also important to engage, interact with, and recruit community members, consumers, groups, donors, stakeholders to your client or your business. And this again comes in the terms of the relations side of public relations. You're really continually building relationships. PR professionals are also needing to write speeches very often. Sometimes they'll actually be giving the speeches, but more often PR professionals ghostwrite for politicians and others in order to make that person sound um, on brand and within the organization's policies. You also want to counsel leadership on communication issues. And so often, as a PR professional, you'll be called in by a business CEO or management in order to talk about how they can effectively communicate policies or things that are happening. You're also in charge of publicity of special events, managing crises, and a lot of PR professionals are now also having to do a great deal of market and audience research. And so, background in research as an undergrad can really help prepare you for a PR career as well. So, a lot more goes into PR than I think a lot of people realize. And the responsibilities of PR professionals, as I have said, are continuing to grow because websites have become a main player in PR because you're having to create content for websites. You're having to manage and update these websites, which can either be external facing to the public, or you can have an intranet, like a company website that only employees can access, and you have to manage and update that too. And then, of course, managing search engine optimization and keyword word usage. These are all very intricate things that PR professionals are having to deal with in the digital mediums. Social media also enables companies, celebrities, and politicians to interact with audiences on a more personal level than they have been able to do ever before. And so it adds this wonderful new tool, but an additional responsibility. Now, I know a lot of students often dream of becoming bloggers or YouTube stars, and they think they can make a lot of money off of it. And sometimes you can. I actually have some very good friends who are bloggers who make pretty good money blogging, but it has been a long journey for them. And they have really had to use a lot of the PR tactics that we're talking about in creating those blogs or YouTube's channels or podcasts in order to promote themselves. But one thing that your textbook notes that I think is important in terms of regulating PR is a note that in 2009, the FTC ruled that bloggers have to disclose any relationship that they have with a company. So if a company sends you free stuff or you're essentially acting as a spokesperson through your blog or YouTube channel podcast for a company, you have to be explicit in telling the audience that you're doing so you can no longer just say, hey, I used this product and it was awesome. You need to say, they sent me this product, I used it and it was awesome. Newsjacking is another tactic of PR professionals that your textbook talks about. And newsjacking is when you take current events that are currently going on and attach your brain to it. So, for instance, when the blackouts were happening a couple of years back, there were multiple campaigns that talked about blackouts and things like that. And so it's essentially utilizing what's going on in the world around you to connect it to your brand voice and values, whether it's in a clever way like they have done here, or with the recent social justice movements, a lot of PR professionals were then responsible for communicating about how their organization was responding to social justice movements. Now, crisis PR is the use of PR and communication professionals to respond when a disaster happens or a crisis happens in an organization. And this can be, a natural disaster, such as a tornado strike, a hurricane, etc. It can be man-made, like with these incidents where the oil spills or the rig explosion. And so, at any type of disaster or crisis needs to be responded to. And of course, this can also be an internal crisis, like your CEO is arrested or under scrutiny for sexual allegations or something like that. These are all crises that PR professionals have to deal with regularly. So, some of the most well known cases of PR crisis are the Exxon Valdez scandal, the BP oil spill, and the Tylenol poisoning. And so we'll walk through these really quickly. In terms of the Exxon Valdez spill, this was when an Exxon ship began leaking and released 11 million gallons of fuel into the ocean. And so PR representatives advised a very quick response, but they were not listened to because PR professionals at the time were not held in very high esteem, and no chief officers were sent to the location. And so Exxon had a really hard time recovering in its public image because they were seen as uncaring. They were seen as not wanting to respond to it because leadership was not on site. And Exxon ended up spending $2 billion to clean up that oil spill and also its image. Now, the BP Gulf oil spill happened after this. An oil rig exploded and killed 11 workers, and over 200 million gallons of oil were released in the Gulf. And of course, this created a huge disaster for the environment. It was obviously a very big issue, but their response was very a lack of caring. And Tony Hayward, who's pictured here was one of BP's main leaders. He tended to be one of the primary spokesmen for this Gulf oil spill and was found saying things like he wanted to get his life back. And he talked about all of the small people on the Gulf. And so obviously, this became a PR crisis, not only in terms of the oil spill, but in the sense of their leadership not seeming caring or responding in an appropriate manner. And they spent over $20 billion in recovery, both of the environment and their image. Now, when you're responding to a crisis, it doesn't always have to be a bad thing. And a couple of years ago, or many years ago now, Tylenol, uh, the bottles were being tampered with and people were lacing them with poison. And actually, 7 people died during this, which isn't a lot of people, but it created this fear of using Tylenol. And so Johnson and Johnson, along with PR professionals, the PR firm Burleson and Marsteller, pulled all their Tylenol off of the shelves, in almost what was seen as almost an overreaction to the incident. It cost the company $100 million and it cut their market share in half. But the PR firm, using a lot of research and uses of media relations, were able to make this into a pro that Tylenol cared so much about their consumers that they were willing to hurt themselves economically in order to protect their clients. And so 3 months later, they came up with tamper resistant bottles. So now you have, the Tylenol bottles that you can't actually just twist open. You have to be able to take the tops off. If you've ever wondered why you have to peel back the silver top on a pill bottle or get the cotton ball out, things like that, it's because it's making it tamper resistant, so people can't walk into the store and place it with poison. And so this created Tylenol as a leader in the industry, someone who was really caring. And in less than 3 years after this incident, Tylenol regained its dominant share of the market and actually increased their sales overall. And so this is an example of how good crisis PR, even when bad things happen to a company, when PR is used effectively, can actually move that crisis to an opportunity. So now that we've talked a little bit about PR, I want you to go ahead and do your discussion post, and then make sure you watch the guest lecture with Honora Picnic, who works in public relations for a local church organization. You can hear what it's like to be a day in the life of a PR professional. And then we will begin reviewing for the final exam